of taking control of properties tied to Donald Trump, following a sweeping civil fraud ruling that legal analysts are calling one of the most severe ever issued against a former president. The judge overseeing the case did not simply reject Trump's last-ditch legal efforts. She dismantled them. Trump's attorneys filed emergency motions, arguing the seizures were unconstitutional, politically motivated, and would cause irreparable harm to his business empire. The court's response was blunt and blistering, labeling those arguments frivolous, legally baseless, and an affront to the integrity of the court. This moment traces back to the investigation launched by Letitia James, which found a years-long pattern of inflated and deflated property valuations used strategically across loans, insurance filings, and tax documents. The court found this was not accidental, it was systematic. And tonight, that legal accountability is no longer abstract. It is physical, it is visible, and it is happening.
Okay, so the Supreme Court just dropped what might be the most explosive ruling of Trump's entire second term, and the White House is in absolute chaos right now. We're talking about a last-second decision that just declared Trump's military operations in Venezuela completely illegal. And this isn't some minor procedural setback. This is a full-blown constitutional crisis that could fundamentally reshape executive power for generations. The court didn't just push back on Trump's Venezuela strategy. They essentially ruled that the president launched an unauthorized war, violated the separation of powers, and exceeded his constitutional authority in ways that legal experts are calling absolutely unprecedented. And here's what makes this even more massive. This decision came down literally hours before a planned major escalation in Caracas, meaning the Supreme Court just pulled the emergency brake on an active military operation in real time. Republican leadership is in full meltdown mode behind closed doors. Trump's national security team is reportedly divided on how to respond. And foreign allies are watching in complete disbelief as the American system of checks and balances plays out on the world stage in the middle of an international crisis. Now, before we dive into exactly what happened and why this changes everything, I need to be completely honest with you about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full story on decisions like this. The major networks are either downplaying the constitutional implications or turning this into pure partisan theater without explaining what this actually means for presidential power and American foreign policy. That's exactly why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and absolutely no corporate spin. We break down these massive developments in a way that helps you understand not just what happened, but why it matters and what comes next. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and really understand how power works in Washington, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, cutting through the noise to deliver the analysis you actually need. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about understanding the truth behind these massive political developments, this is your moment to subscribe and be part of something bigger. All right, let's get back to the video.
As the holiday break, the holiday recess is just wrapping up. Obviously, a very busy time back here in Washington, Senator. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You have said already over the course of the last, looking at my clock, 14 hours or so since this operation has unfolded, that you believe there is no justification for the United States to be at war with Venezuela. So a couple of questions for you, sir. Do you believe that the U.S. is currently at war with Venezuela?
Look, like anything else we understand in this world, the one thing I know is when people are shooting and shooting back, that is war, right? And that's what exactly has occurred here. Number two, the nature of this is it's all illegal. What we heard so far, there are three different reasons why we went after this man. And now they're saying they were going to occupy a foreign country, we're going to run it from the United States, and that we're going to steal their oil. In what world did this administration get any of that permission ever for them to do that? Did not come from the United States citizens, did not come from Congress. Therefore, it is illegal. Let us be clear. This is a war of choice. We're lucky it has gone as well as it has. So a great military force. It's great that, in all essence, Maduro is out. The fact is we violated the Constitution of the United States. We are weaker as a country when we start violating the Constitution of the United States for these illegal wars, and we're not going to be better off in the future.
So just to be clear, you don't buy the argument that the Trump administration, that the president himself has made as justification for this, which is that it's in the best national security interest of the United States, they say, to put a stop to the drug trafficking that they say Maduro has undertaken.
Well, the problem is, like, so far that message has changed so many times. Now it's oil. Now it's that we're going to control the government. Now it's that, yes, maybe it's drugs, but also just about 3 weeks ago, you also pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was also a convicted drug dealer. So we all know this is BS. This is a war of occupation. This has been building up for a while. I said this a couple of weeks ago. They're just trying to get people acclimatized to the idea of us going to war. And this is what actually has happened. The whole MAGA crowd that have been talking about ending wars, just got duped by their own man, who basically had been slowly kind of calibrating us to the point where we're going to get to this situation. There's no reason why you have F-35s involved in a war. There's no reason why you have so many Navy ships involved in a war if you're just doing a police action. All this is one more excuse for us to either occupy Venezuela, take their oil, and more importantly, you're violating the Constitution of the United States. And that's the problem is here. You're violating what we should be doing right now, is making sure that we are going to war for proper reasons. And by the way, also for proper outcomes. These guys have no clue what they're doing. They have no clue. They can't tell us who's in charge of Venezuela right now. They can't tell us what the end goal of this is. But now we are involved in this war, and we don't know what the end result is.
So here's what happened. For the past several months, the Trump administration has been conducting what they've officially called counter-narcotics operations in Venezuela, but what multiple sources have described as effectively a military campaign to force regime change in Caracas. It started back in late 2025 with increased drone surveillance, then expanded to naval blockades in the Caribbean, then moved to coordinated airstrikes on what the administration called cartel infrastructure, but what international observers identified as Venezuelan government facilities. By early 2026, the United States had thousands of personnel in Colombia, hundreds of aircraft conducting daily sorties into Venezuelan airspace, and special operations forces operating on the ground in coordination with opposition groups. The administration never went to Congress for authorization. Trump's legal team argued he was operating under existing counter-narcotics statutes, emergency powers related to the humanitarian crisis, and inherent executive authority as commander-in-chief to protect American interests in the region. They pointed to the flow of migrants, the drug trade, and alleged threats to American citizens as justification. Defense Secretary testified before Congress that this wasn't a war in the traditional sense, but rather an extended law enforcement operation with military assets. But the reality on the ground told a completely different story. American forces were engaged in sustained combat operations. There were firefights with Venezuelan military units. The administration was coordinating with Venezuelan opposition forces to establish control over territory. Intelligence reports leaked to major newspapers showed planning documents that explicitly discussed post-Maduro governance structures and transition planning for Caracas. This wasn't counter-narcotics enforcement. This was regime change through military force. And it was all happening without a declaration of war, without an authorization for use of military force from Congress, and without any of the constitutional processes that are supposed to govern American military action abroad. Democratic leadership in Congress had been screaming about this for months, filing lawsuit after lawsuit, but the administration kept arguing that courts shouldn't interfere with presidential war powers, and that this was a political question for the elected branches to resolve, not the judiciary. Then, 3 weeks ago, a coalition of Democratic senators, joined by a handful of Republicans who were deeply uncomfortable with the constitutional precedent being set, filed an emergency petition with the Supreme Court. They argued that Trump was conducting a war in direct violation of the Constitution's explicit grant of war powers to Congress, that he was using appropriated military funding for purposes Congress never authorized, and that the entire operation violated both domestic and international law. The administration fought the petition hard, arguing the court had no jurisdiction, that military operations were within presidential discretion, and that even considering the case would damage national security by revealing operational details. Most legal experts thought the court would decline to hear it, or at least slow-walk the process. The conventional wisdom was that the Supreme Court never intervenes in active military operations, that war powers cases are almost impossible to win, and that the conservative majority would defer to presidential authority on national security. That conventional wisdom just got absolutely destroyed. This morning, in a stunning 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's Venezuela operations are unconstitutional, ordered an immediate halt to offensive military action, and demanded that the administration provide a full accounting of the legal basis for the operation to Congress within 30 days. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion, joined by the 3 liberal justices and Justices Gorsuch and Barrett. The opinion is absolutely brutal in its assessment of the administration's legal reasoning. Roberts wrote that the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief does not include the power to unilaterally commit the United States to sustained military conflict without congressional authorization. He went through the administration's arguments one by one and dismantled them systematically. The counter-narcotic statutes? They authorize law enforcement cooperation and limited military support, not full-scale combat operations. Emergency powers? They require an actual emergency threatening the United States itself, not a foreign policy preference for regime change. Inherent executive authority? The framers explicitly rejected giving the president unilateral war powers, which is why they gave Congress the power to declare war. And here's where Roberts absolutely demolishes the administration's position. He writes, if the president's theory were correct, if extended military campaigns could be launched without congressional authorization, simply by characterizing them as counter-narcotics operations, or humanitarian interventions, or protection of American interests, then the Constitution's allocation of war powers to Congress would be rendered meaningless. Every president could launch wars of choice by finding a statutory hook or claiming inherent authority, and the people's representatives would be reduced to spectators in decisions of war and peace. The opinion goes on to detail specific operations that clearly constitute acts of war. Sustained bombing campaigns, ground combat operations, coordination with opposition forces to seize territory, planning for regime change and post-conflict governance. Roberts notes that the administration's own internal documents, which were submitted to the court under seal, explicitly describe the operation as aimed at removal of the Maduro regime and installation of a democratic government friendly to American interests. The decision orders an immediate cessation of offensive operations. The administration can maintain defensive postures to protect American personnel during withdrawal, but cannot conduct strikes, cannot expand operations, and must begin immediately developing a plan to extract forces from the region. The court also ordered the administration to provide Congress with a full legal justification for the operation, including all legal memoranda, all intelligence assessments used to justify the action, and all communications between the White House, Defense Department, and State Department regarding authorization. Basically, the Supreme Court just forced Trump to show his work to Congress, and if that work shows what everyone suspects, which is that the administration knew this exceeded constitutional authority and proceeded anyway, the political fallout is going to be absolutely catastrophic. Justice Thomas wrote a dissenting opinion, joined by Justices Alito and Kavanaugh, arguing that the court is overstepping its authority and interfering with core executive functions. Thomas writes that presidents have historically exercised broad military powers without prior congressional authorization, that the political branches should resolve these disputes, and that the court's intervention could damage national security by constraining the president's ability to respond to threats. But even Thomas's dissent doesn't really defend the specific operation in Venezuela. Instead, it argues that even if the operation exceeds presidential authority, the remedy is political, through Congress's appropriations power and potentially impeachment, not judicial intervention. The fact that Thomas can't or won't defend the constitutional basis for the operation itself tells you everything about how weak the administration's legal position actually is. Now, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications go way beyond Venezuela and way beyond Trump. First, understand that this is the most significant war powers decision from the Supreme Court in modern American history. The court has traditionally been extremely reluctant to wade into disputes between the president and Congress over military operations. During the Vietnam War, multiple cases challenging presidential authority were dismissed or avoided on procedural grounds. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the court stayed out entirely. The conventional wisdom was that war powers were a political question, that presidents had vast discretion in military affairs, and that the court would never tell a sitting president to halt an ongoing operation. That precedent just got shattered. The Supreme Court has now clearly stated that there are limits to presidential war powers, that those limits are justiciable, meaning courts can and will enforce them, and that the Constitution's allocation of war powers to Congress is not a dead letter that presidents can ignore whenever they find it inconvenient. Second, this decision fundamentally constrains every future president's ability to launch military operations without congressional authorization. Trump's legal team tried to build a pathway for presidents to conduct sustained military campaigns by piecing together various statutes, emergency powers, and inherent authority arguments. The Supreme Court just closed that pathway completely. Roberts' opinion makes clear that sustained military conflict requires congressional authorization. Period. You can't get around that by calling it something else, by finding a creative statutory interpretation, or by claiming inherent authority. If a president wants to commit the United States to war, they need to go to Congress and get authorization. This is a massive reassertion of congressional power after decades of presidential expansion in military affairs. Third, this creates an enormous immediate crisis for the Trump administration. They have active military personnel engaged in operations in Venezuela right now. They have intelligence assets in place, special operations forces coordinating with opposition groups, naval vessels conducting blockades, aircraft conducting daily missions. All of that has to stop. The administration has to transition to a defensive posture and then begin withdrawing. But here's the problem. Venezuela isn't going to suddenly become safe for American withdrawal just because the Supreme Court issued a ruling. The administration is going to have to negotiate with the Maduro regime to ensure safe passage for American forces. They're going to have to abandon opposition groups that they've been supporting and arming for months. They're going to have to accept a major defeat and the continuation of a regime they've spent enormous political and military capital trying to remove. And they're going to have to do all of this while explaining to the American public and to allies around the world why they launched an unauthorized war in the first place. Fourth, the political implications heading into the 2026 midterms are absolutely massive. Democrats are going to run on this hard. They're going to argue that Trump launched an illegal war, that he violated the Constitution, that he put American lives at risk without authorization from the people's representatives, and that the Supreme Court had to step in to stop him. They're going to demand full investigations into who knew what and when, how the decision to expand operations was made, whether intelligence was manipulated to justify the operation, and whether Trump deliberately circumvented constitutional processes. Republicans are going to be in an impossible position. Defending the operation means defending unauthorized presidential war powers, which many Republicans are philosophically opposed to, especially when they imagine a future Democratic president using those same powers. But criticizing Trump means breaking with the party's leader in an election year and potentially fracturing the Republican coalition. Fifth, this has enormous implications for Trump's relationship with the military and national security establishment. The court's decision essentially states that Trump committed American forces to an unconstitutional military operation. Defense Secretary is going to have to testify before Congress about his role in this. Military commanders are going to have to explain what legal advice they received and why they believe the operation was authorized. Intelligence officials are going to be asked whether they raised concerns about the legal basis for the operation. You're going to see a wave of resignations, reassignments, and internal investigations. The relationship between the White House and the Pentagon, which has already been strained during Trump's second term, is about to get significantly worse. Military leaders are going to be extremely reluctant to execute any future operations that aren't clearly authorized by Congress, which fundamentally constrains Trump's ability to use military force for the remainder of his presidency. Sixth, the international implications are staggering. America's allies have been watching this Venezuela operation with growing concern. European leaders have been quietly expressing worry about what this means for the rule-based international order. If the United States launches unauthorized military operations against governments it doesn't like, how is that different from what America criticizes Russia or China for doing? NATO allies have been particularly concerned because they worry about being asked to support American operations that lack clear legal authorization. This Supreme Court decision actually helps restore some international credibility by showing that American institutions still function as checks on executive power. But it also reveals that Trump was willing to launch an unauthorized war, which is going to make allies extremely cautious about any future American military proposals or security commitments. You're going to see allies demanding much more concrete evidence of congressional authorization before they support or participate in American military operations going forward. Seventh, this affects the Maduro regime's calculations in profound ways. Maduro was facing an existential threat from American military operations. Now, suddenly he knows those operations have to stop. The Supreme Court just handed him a massive victory. He's going to claim this as proof that American aggression failed, that Venezuela stood strong against imperialism, that the American system is in crisis and can't sustain its foreign adventures. He's going to use this to consolidate power domestically and to strengthen relationships with Russia, China, Iran, and other anti-American governments. The Venezuelan opposition groups that were counting on American support are going to feel betrayed and abandoned. The regional implications are enormous. Colombia, which has been hosting American forces and supporting the operation, is going to face renewed pressure from Venezuela and potential security threats as American forces withdraw. Brazil and other regional powers are going to have to recalibrate their strategies, now that American regime change efforts have been halted by the Supreme Court. Eighth, this decision raises massive questions about other American military operations around the world. If the Venezuela operation is unconstitutional, what about operations in Syria, Somalia, Yemen? The United States has forces conducting military operations in dozens of countries, many without specific congressional authorization, relying instead on broad interpretations of existing authorizations from decades ago, or on creative readings of presidential powers. This decision suggests that many of those operations might not survive judicial scrutiny if challenged. You're going to see members of Congress, particularly progressives who have long been concerned about endless wars, filing new lawsuits challenging other operations. You're going to see military commanders demanding clearer legal authority before conducting operations. You're going to see a fundamental rethinking of how the United States uses military force around the world. Ninth, the economic and market implications matter here too. The Venezuela operation was partly justified as necessary to protect American energy interests and to prevent further refugee flows that affect the American economy. Markets had priced in either regime change in Venezuela, which would potentially open up Venezuelan oil production and reduce regional instability, or a prolonged American military commitment to contain the Maduro regime. Neither of those scenarios is happening now. Instead, American forces are going to withdraw, Maduro stays in power, and regional instability likely increases. Oil markets are going to react to this uncertainty. Companies that were planning on post-Maduro investment opportunities in Venezuela are going to have to completely revise their strategies. The migrant and refugee flows that the administration claimed to be addressing are going to continue or potentially accelerate, which has domestic political and economic consequences heading into 2026. 10th, this raises profound questions about Trump's decision-making process and who was advising him. The president doesn't launch a military operation of this scale without extensive consultation with lawyers, military advisors, intelligence officials, and political advisors. Somebody told Trump he had the authority to do this. Somebody assured him that courts wouldn't intervene, or that if they did, the administration would win. Those people were catastrophically wrong. Congress is going to want to know who gave that advice, what the internal debates looked like, whether there were dissenting legal opinions that were ignored, and whether the president was fully informed of the constitutional risks he was taking. You're going to see former officials testifying, documents subpoenaed, and a complete public dissection of how this decision was made. And if it turns out that Trump was advised that this was legally questionable but proceeded anyway because he didn't think courts would intervene, or because he prioritized policy goals over constitutional limits, that's an impeachment-level revelation. The bottom line here is this. The Supreme Court just handed Trump one of the most humiliating defeats of his political career, and fundamentally reset the boundaries of presidential power in ways that will affect every future administration. This isn't a narrow technical ruling about a specific statute. This is the Supreme Court telling the President of the United States that he launched an unconstitutional war, that he exceeded his authority in ways that violate the fundamental structure of American government, and that he has to stop immediately and account for his actions to Congress. The political fallout is going to dominate the news cycle for months. Republicans are going to be divided between those who defend Trump and those who defend constitutional limits on executive power. Democrats are going to use this as Exhibit A in their argument that Trump is authoritarian and dangerous. Foreign allies are going to be more cautious about supporting American military operations. Military and intelligence officials are going to be far more careful about executing presidential directives without clear congressional authorization. And Trump himself is going to be significantly constrained for the remainder of his presidency, because everyone now knows the Supreme Court will actually intervene to stop unauthorized military operations. This decision also has massive implications for how historians and legal scholars understand the Trump presidency. This is going to be taught in law schools and political science courses for generations as the case that defined the limits of presidential war powers in the modern era. Roberts's opinion is going to be studied alongside Youngstown Steel during the Korean War, and the war powers resolution debates of the 1970s as a defining moment in the separation of powers. And the fact that it took the Supreme Court intervening to stop an active military operation shows just how far presidential power had expanded and how necessary these institutional checks actually are. Over the next several days and weeks, watch for several key developments. First, watch how the administration responds. Do they comply immediately and fully, or do they try to slow-walk compliance and maintain operations under the guise of defensive measures? Any resistance to the court's order would be an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Second, watch what happens in Congress. Democrats are going to launch investigations immediately. The question is whether any Republicans join them. If even a handful of Senate Republicans support a serious investigation into how this operation was authorized and who knew what, that could fracture the party heading into 2026. Third, watch the military and intelligence community. Are there resignations? Do officials start leaking to protect themselves and establish that they raised concerns? The internal dynamics at defense and state are going to be absolutely brutal. Fourth, watch Venezuela and the region. How does Maduro respond? Do opposition groups collapse without American support? Does regional instability increase? Do refugee flows spike? Fifth, watch America's allies, particularly in Europe and NATO. Do they use this as an opportunity to distance themselves from Trump's foreign policy approach? Do they demand new safeguards before participating in any future American operations? And finally, watch the 2026 campaign. This is going to be one of the defining issues of the midterms. Democrats have a clear, simple message. Trump launched an illegal war, and the Supreme Court had to stop him. That's devastating. Republicans are going to struggle to respond because defending the operation means defending unauthorized presidential wars, which violates conservative principles and sets dangerous precedents. The political battlefield just shifted dramatically in Democrats' favor, and Trump's team knows it. The chaos in the White House right now isn't just about military strategy or foreign policy. It's about the sudden realization that this Supreme Court decision might have just cost Republicans control of Congress in 2026 and potentially damaged Trump's chances if he runs again in 2028. This is the kind of decision that reshapes political careers, redefines institutional boundaries, and redirects the course of American history. And it all came down in a last-second ruling that nobody saw coming, but that everybody is going to remember as one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions of this era. Keep your eyes on this story, because it's far from over, and the implications are going to be playing out for years to come.